Hello everyone and welcome to the Borg Skeptic Show. I'm glad to see you here and I've been having a great day. I hope you've been having a great day as well. For all those in the chat, thank you for joining us. At the moment we've got Cat the Humanist. I'm sure more people will join in momentarily. We've got a good show tonight planned, but before we get into that, I will play the channel intro and then I'll introduce the co-host and guest. So once again, thank you for joining us. Tonight we've got a very special show. Got a very special guest joining us. But before we get into that, I'd like to welcome all those who are in the chat. Susan Brewer, Cat the Humanist, thank you for joining us. And our co-host for tonight is the one and only Scott Williamson. How are you doing tonight, Scott?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing absolutely fine, thank you. So as I was saying, tonight we're going to be talking about biblical slavery, mainly. And tonight's guest is a PhD in Assyriology, the writer of Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery, and the co-creator of Digital Hammurabi YouTube channel. And that is Dr. Josh Bowen. How are you doing tonight, Josh?
I'm doing very well. Thank you both for having me on.
Thank you very much for joining us. Looking very much forward to tonight's conversation. So biblical slavery, and did the Old Testament endorse it? It's a very interesting subject. Would you like to start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself and your position on that?
Yeah, sure. So for anybody that doesn't know me, Joshua Bowen, I was an evangelical fundamentalist Christian for 26 years. I think, born and raised in a Christian family, went to church 3 times a week, like as you do. And, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a missionary. And then ultimately I decided I wanted to become a pastor, because that's the thing you do in high school youth group. You start off wanting to be a youth pastor, but then you mature, and you want to become a regular pastor. So I went to join the Air Force when I was 17, and I got my bachelor's degree while I was on active duty from Liberty University. So, very evangelical school. And became a chaplain, got commissioned as a lieutenant, and started seminary. And I did like the big seminary degree. It took me 6 years to do it. I got a master's in theology. I wrote my master's thesis it was a Hebrew thesis on the divine name El Shaddai, what it meant and sort of thing, its usage. And applied to go to Johns Hopkins, was accepted there in the Assyriology department, or the Ancient Near Eastern Studies department, as an Assyriologist, which just means I studied the ancient Near East more broadly, particularly ancient Mesopotamia, from about 3000 to 300 BCE. And there were four parts to our department. Essentially, there was the archaeology department, or the archaeology section, the Hebrew Bible section, the Assyriology section, and the Egyptology section. And we all, that made up the Ancient Near Eastern Studies department. But it was during that time that, I became an atheist, and it became very difficult for me to honestly engage with the ancient Near Eastern literature and history, and still hold to the core tenets of the faith as I saw them. I kind of slipped back into a soft agnosticism for a long time, primarily because I didn't care. During the majority of my doctoral work, like my faith wasn't really it wasn't an issue, belief and that sort of thing wasn't an issue. It was getting your dissertation done is what mattered. So, but when I graduated, sorry, I'm probably going into more detail than anybody wants here, but
No, that's fine.
when I graduated, some sort of difficult life circumstances took place in our family, which essentially resulted in us having to stay in this area indefinitely. And this area is not terribly conducive to getting a tenure track position somewhere in our field. So I've become like an independent researcher. I have a full-time job doing other stuff outside of academia, but in my spare time, I still like to work in the field, more at a popular level, which is why Megan started our YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi, and I kind of help her with it, and not that she needs my help, but we try to make all the stuff that we spent all those years. She's getting her PhD as well in the same field, and she has a master's, two master's degrees as well in ancient Near Eastern studies, and we just try to make that material sort of palatable to popular, audiences that are interested in the ancient world but don't have the time and the opportunity to, be able to do what we had the opportunity to do. So I write books on popular level things. You mentioned the one on slavery. I wrote, Megan and I wrote one on how to learn Sumerian for the absolute beginner, which is our popular one, surprisingly. I recently published my dissertation as a popular level book, which is called Learning to Pray in a Dead Language, Education and Invocation in Ancient Sumerian, which it's a fun book, but, maybe not as interesting to like a biblical audience. But the book did the Old Testament endorse slavery, sort of bringing it all home. Back to what you were really asking me probably in the beginning. Tell us your name and then tell us about slavery. It's probably what you were asking, but no.
That's okay.
But yeah. But when I got online, very quickly, I was surprised to see that there were so many Christian apologists that were like strenuously defending slavery in the Old Testament. And I just found that so bizarre. And I have a lot of evangelical friends in academia. Probably one of my best friends, definitely my best friend going through Hopkins, was an evangelical Christian, went to Trinity out in Chicago, or out in Illinois. It's in Chicago. I think it's in Illinois. Mm-hmm. Anyway. And, he's out of Tyndale now. And I said to him at a conference, hey, there are people that defend slavery. And he was, well, why? I don't know. But I heard the arguments sort of coming back against it were, I thought they were on the whole good, but could use a little bit of nuance and a whole lot of like biblical and ancient Near Eastern support behind them. So like saying things like, Exodus 21 is like a guide for beating your slave to, to death and getting away with it. Like I get what the point is, and that's like sort of right, but that's not the point. That's not like the goal of the law. That's the result of the law, no question. But it's not the point. So that's why I wrote the book. I did a series of videos responding to a fellow by the name of What Do You Meme? It's not his real name. I don't remember his real name, but
You sure?
He did a series of videos on slavery, and so I responded to those, and then sort of took that research and put it into a popular level book. I'm going to shut up now.
No, I think everyone's really enjoying listening to listening to your life story and how you got to where you are today. I mean, it's amazing stuff, to think about the amount of research that you've done and the amount of skills that you've got when it comes to, it's quite refreshing considering, as you mentioned, the amount of arguments that people are making without backing it up with any of the the actual the Hebrew verses and what it was actually getting at, and so I think everyone's really interested to hear about that.
There seems to be, two things going on with people at the same time and I'm talking about the people that would defend slavery. That does seem really weird and crazy, but I would think that the first thing is that, well, first of all, they start off with the premise that the Bible is the infallible word of Yahweh, right? And so anything he says has got to be right and exact. And then the other thing too is that the world out there, outside of their religious thinking, is the devil. They're basically, they're going to mislead you and tell you that oh no, the slavery's wrong and the Hebrews did endorse slavery, right? And so these kind of two things are playing against this notion of morality where, well, wait a minute, I think slavery's wrong. I wouldn't want to be a slave. So why would an infallible God make it okay? Yeah. But then I can't listen to these guys that tell me God says it's okay because, well, you can't trust them, right? So they're kind of stuck in this little weird place in their life where they have to kind of defend what they know is wrong, but they have to kind of spin it in a way that makes it right. And, there's a shortage of like you said, apologists out there that work fervently to defend slavery and argue for it. And they have these slavery apologists, and it's really weird.
Yeah, I've been, I'd say it's much to my dismay, I think, that there's always seemingly a new angle that somebody's trying to work, to the point that, I guess on the one hand, I've seen a lot of progress in these discussions that I've been having, which is good, in that people, there are certain arguments that people don't bring up anymore, at least not usually, because I think they've been, it's clear they're not correct. But it's gotten to the point now where it really is a type of grasping at straws, where that straw is, well, was it really immoral? I heard I won't mention anybody's name, but I heard someone say very seriously recently, Exodus 21, the wife was owned by the master. She was his property. And so obviously, if he gave her to the slave as a wife, and they had kids, she's his property, and the kid is his property. So it only makes sense that they wouldn't go out free with the husband. What's immoral about that?
Exactly. So it doesn't add up, does it?
Yeah. What now? I'm with you all the way up through that. Yep, that's what it says. Yep, that's what it says. It's that last bit. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Do what? So,
yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think Exodus 21 is so I've actually pulled up some of the verses that talk about slavery in the Bible, Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25. If you want me to read out Exodus 21 and we can, discuss what's actually being said there.
Yeah, sure. If you start off with, you can read verse 1, but 1 through 6 is usually the like the
Yeah.
first section. We can talk about that.
Yeah, I'll do that. That sounds good. Yeah, so I've got that. I've got I'm taking from the NIV, and it's from So I've got from verse 2 to 6. Is that okay?
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
So if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master, and my wife and children do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant... Oh, no, sorry, that's verse 7. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, I mean, so for anybody listening, this isn't really mysterious, right? I know a lot of people... there are probably a lot of people that will hear this and go, "Oh my God, the NIV! Well, that's the devil." It's not. NIV's pretty good translation. They're just trying to make sense of what the Hebrew says. So it's not like if you read that in Hebrew, it's not like, oh, completely different. That's it makes so much more sense now if you read it in the Hebrew. I mean, there are certain things that are clearer, but it doesn't change the main idea. Like what you just heard, that's what it says. And not good, right? There's no worky. So, just so that it's, just maybe put it in different terms, and then we can discuss it. The principle here is these types of laws are very common in the ancient Near East, and they're called casuistic. They're case laws. They're set up as if this happens, then do this. Then this happens. So if you read through like the laws of Hammurabi or the laws of Ornamu, or the laws of Lipit-Ishtar, any of these old law codes, you'll see this sort of if then. They call that casuistic law, case law. And what that means is we don't have to go into all that because that's, I think, a different topic. So what's happening here is it's taking a particular case and it's saying, okay, let's sort of break it down. Let's give the main thing that could happen and then sort of the sub-tier circumstances that might come in under that heading, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So if a man sells himself, or a man purchases somebody, however you want to read that, he's to serve for 6 years. That's it. Released in the 7th. Debt's paid at that point. So, if I go, take out a loan for grain from, Jim Bob, and I can't pay it back because I have a bad crop year or something, and the time comes for that loan to be repaid, and I can't do it. The law says, all right, if you don't have any money to repay it, you don't have any land that you've sold off, any of that stuff, then you can be sold as a debt slave. So your slavery is contingent upon that debt. Once the debt disappears, however that happens, then the slavery disappears. Mm-hmm. The problem with debt slavery today, in the ancient past, whenever, is that debt slavery had this sort of cumulative problem. So if I went into Jim Bob's debt service, so let's say I owed him $100, and he said, all right, if you serve me for 3 years, you'll pay off that $100 or whatever, 100 shekels of silver. Well, as I start to serve him, I'm living in his house, eating his food, and he's adding that up. Okay, $10 a week for food, $20 a week for shelter. So now, even though I'm paying off the principal, these other things are adding up on top of it. So actually, I'm not I'm not working fast enough or enough to pay. The principal's growing.
Yeah.
So debt servitude ultimately, in a lot of cases, led to chattel slavery. It just was, you couldn't get out of it. So the laws in the ancient Near East in general, this isn't just the Hebrew Bible, laws in the ancient Near East in general, were sort of set up, rule was sort of set up so that there was a limit to debt servitude. So for example, in the laws of Hammurabi, you'll see debt slave, somebody gets distrained for 3 years, they go free in the fourth, done. Right? You can't compile this stuff, compound this, this debt. When kings would come to the throne, they would often declare an edict that was called a Andoraru or a Misharam edict, which was essentially just all the debts for all the citizens done away with, wiped clean. Everybody sort of goes back to square one. And this was to keep, keep the money sort of evenly distributed, more or less. Sort of the ancient Near Eastern Robin Hood, I guess. And so the biblical text picks up on this, right? And so the Bible says, all right, 6 years he serves, 7th year, no matter what he owed, whatever it was, it's done. But then it says, all right, situation 1, what if he comes in and he's married? Well, the answer, if he came in with a wife, goes out with a wife. If he came in single, goes out single. If he came in and the master who owned this slave, this female slave, gave that female slave to the debt slave, the male debt slave, which was for sexual usage, like in case that's unclear to anybody. This is to create more slaves. I mean, this is the purpose of doing it. The master's not like, that guy looks lonely. I can go get my slave and give him a wife. No, I mean, this is the way to produce more slaves. So that I think makes the whole situation make even more sense to people. So that the master's giving, he can't give that slave to somebody else now, right? Anyway. So the wife of this guy, the slave, stays the property of the master, and any fruit from their union stays his as well. And so, Paul Copan, for example, and I like Paul Copan. I don't know if you guys know who Paul Copan is, but he wrote the book, Is God a Moral Monster? And he has a section, a couple chapters on slavery. And he makes the comment that, well, the situation that this guy faces is he could like leave and go save up his shekels, is the verbiage that he uses, and then go back and buy that his wife's freedom and his children's freedom. Well, there's a faulty notion there. And that faulty notion is that she's a debt slave. Well, she's not. She's a chattel slave. There's no debt, that her slavery is hinging upon, which is the reason for this law. Because any other situation, I mean, ostensibly, if he came in, it wouldn't be, either she would be released before him or she would be released very shortly thereafter, right? So this wouldn't be an issue. This idea of him then volunteering to be a slave for life, to become a chattel slave, would be ridiculous. Why would you do that? Just, wait another year.
So all women were chattel slaves in this system, or were all women slaves? Were they all chattel slaves?
That's probably not. And I say that because in Deuteronomy 15, it looks like what we have is so in Exodus 21, you have these laws for the male debt slave.
Yeah.
And then starting in verse 7, it says, as you started to read it, the female slave does not go free as the male slaves do. Well, by the time you get to Deuteronomy 15, that law has been developed. And so the text sort of goes out of its way to say, you will also do this release, these options of release for your female slaves.
Right.
Now, it may mean, and I think it probably does, that's just indicating that this is just a sort of standard female slave that's not being taken as like a concubine or something like we see in Exodus 21. So I don't think, at least by Deuteronomy, I don't think that the text anticipates that all women are going to be debt slaves. Chattel slaves. But it is clear that many women, like there's definitely several situations in which a woman can become a chattel slave. And maybe I'll save that for the next section to talk about that some more. But that's what's going on in that first section.
And a related question, maybe for the audience or for a lot of fundamentalist layman type people that interpret the Bible, interpret this stuff, because clearly what they'll do is they'll try to harmonize the Bible and make it, well, the scripture in Deuteronomy, obviously it's not different than in Exodus. It's just that, the writers left it out, or, but is there some way that you can show that isn't the case, that it in fact did evolve and change over some period of time?
Yeah, certainly. Some of the evidence I think is more explicit than other evidence. There was an article, I think it was written by Levinson. I always forget, but it's called The Creation of the Lemma. I always forget the title too, so it's not really useful for I forget the author and the title, but it has the word lemma in it. Anyway, what he's doing is he's looking very specifically at the verbiage in Exodus 21 and in Leviticus 25, and he's showing, I think, pretty convincingly that Leviticus 25 is essentially turning Exodus 21 on its head, very intentionally, and that sort of adjustment is being made in Deuteronomy as well. And it's not just in the slave laws that you see it. Mm-hmm. By the way, like these aren't my ideas at all. Mm-hmm. This is just consensus scholarship in biblical studies, this sort of development that you see. And I mean, like some of that stuff is a little more detailed. I go into some of it in the book, but really the people that you can look at, any good commentary on Deuteronomy that covers that section will talk about it. But for example, in Exodus 21, 6 years, they're released in the seventh and that's it, right? Just males. And it explicitly says females, no. Well, then in Deuteronomy 15, serve 6, released in the seventh. But now females are very intentionally, it seems, included. And there's a development that says not only do you set them free, but you set them free with all this stuff.
Exactly.
Right? And so, but then by the time you get to Leviticus 25, probably the most stark contrast is that it says you can't keep Israelites as slaves anymore. That's done. Mm-hmm. So, trying to harmonize those things, it's admirable. I think if you have that theological disposition, for example, in Judaism, you see the Jewish scholars, the rabbis trying to figure out like how do these sort of piece together, and I think it's neat to sort of watch how they rationalize that sort of thing. I think it's neat, but it's unnecessary. I think it goes against what the text is actually doing.
Yeah. And that was a question that I had too, that I think is kind of pretty important that people ought to consider is, what is the Hebrew text doing? I guess, and when you say that, you mean like what is kind of like the motives behind the Hebrew text, like in the religion, and what was it actually like in those ancient times, to actually know what the text is doing, because it's so easy to kind of frame it in our modern Western religious viewpoint, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably one of the go-to examples of that I think everybody would understand are the Canaanites, right? If you look at how the Old Testament, if you look at how the Hebrew Bible sets up the Canaanites as sort of the foil, the Philistines, another example, sort of the foil of the Israelites. Yeah, I mean, and this is not something that's unique to the Hebrew Bible. If you go back, gosh, I mean, like if you read through any literary text from the early second millennium, or even from the third millennium, you see like the Westerners, the Amuru, right, or the Martu. There's a literary text in Sumerian called the Marriage of Martu, and the Martu are like these Westerners. They come from, we think, somewhere in the area of like the Jebel el-Bishri, sort of in between Palestine and Iraq, sort of in that area of Syria where the Euphrates River goes up. But this text called the Marriage of Martu, the Martu are considered these, if you know the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're like the Enkidus. They're the uncultured, the uncivilized. They don't know bread. They don't know beer. They don't know what it means to live in a house. They're just these wild, uncivilized people. Yeah. They're the other, right? And they're bad. And so this Marriage of Martu, you have a girl and a woman and her girlfriend that are talking. She's going to marry this Martu guy. And, the girlfriend's like, don't do it. They eat raw meat and they don't know what it's like to be civilized. It's this picture that's being painted of the other, right? And so when you think about the Canaanites, well, if you read through the biblical text and, the way that the Canaanites are pictured coming through the book of Joshua, for example, and watching why the conquest was necessary. I mean, they're just like the most wicked people, backward, evil, horrible, sacrificing all their kids everywhere.
Oh, yeah. That's the picture that, as Jehovah's Witnesses, we were kind of taught that too, that the Canaanites were kind of like the parallel of the world, and we're kind of like God's chosen people. And so the Canaanites were always a cartoon of the evil world out there. Yeah.
And, it's very much like after 9/11 here in the U.S., how people from Middle Eastern countries were depicted, right?
Yeah.
If you were to, I'm in a sort of conservative southern area here, and if you were to talk to people after 9/11 here, it's like, oh man, the Arabs, they're all bad. They're they're out there. They want to all kill us. It's all terrible, and they worship all that, and all they want to do is just these terrible, wicked things. And it's a caricature that's being set up as the other, right? They're all demonized, and they all become this foil, and that can become a motivation for to justify us doing things, right? And so when you think about how the Canaanites are set up, or how the Philistines are set up, or how the Amalekites are set up, or any of these people groups, that what the text is doing is trying to give justification for why it is that Israel has a right to this land, for example, or why the ancient Israelites, their history, the way that they sort of structured it, has them going in and doing conquest. What justifies that? Well, they're wicked, wicked people, right? And this was like a mercy. In the same way, during the flood, if you read through the Akkadian story of Atrahasis, for example, and you see how the main god Enlil, and I'll shut up after this, I apologize. Just going on and on.
Really interesting.
But the main god Enlil, who's responsible for sending the flood, it says in the text, after it's all said and done, Ea, one of the other gods that helps the Noah character build a boat and survive, he says to Enlil, "You're the one that did this evil thing." And this is like trying to make it seem like calamity or so. No, that you did this bad thing. And so this was the way that it was pictured, because Enlil sent the flood because the people populated and populated and populated, and they became so noisy, and all the work that they're doing, and they're populating and all this stuff, and Enlil can't sleep anymore. He just can't rest. And so we got to wipe some of these people out, and I mean ultimately wipe all these people out. So when the biblical text takes very clearly is utilizing the Mesopotamian flood story, the Akkadian flood story, it's doing so very strategically. And one of the things that it's doing, tying it into its own primeval history, is saying, I mean, if you look at how Genesis 6 starts, everybody's wicked. I mean, and they're not just wicked. Every thought of the imagination of their hearts was only evil continually. I mean, like, I'm surprised that God put up with them as long as he did, right? That's the idea. The narrative is trying to say God is not evil Enlil. God is just Yahweh that's bringing judgment because he has to. He has to do it. It's the only way that a just God can act. So the text is doing something in that way.
And there's the aspect of that when it comes to the biblical slavery, tying back into that. There's an aspect of that with the justification for taking these slaves and the treatment of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably a good place to look, outside of that, the famous Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, which, by the way, we are eventually going to make pajamas that say Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, because there was an apologist that said we must sleep in pajamas that have those verses on them. So we're going to do that. We're going to do that here at Digital Hammurabi.
I'll keep an eye out for that. Need a new set of pajamas.
But if you go to Deuteronomy 20 and the rules for war and engaging in warfare, it's very clear that, I mean, it's a chapter that, if you read it, if you haven't read it, and you'll go, oh man, what in the world? How this is terrible. Because the rules of engagement there are two types of cities, right? There are cities that are outside of Israel proper, outside of the Promised Land, and then there are those inside of the Promised Land. Well, the ones inside the Promised Land, you wipe them out, you kill everybody, right? That's not the question. But the ones outside the city, outside of the country, they have a shot, right? So what what Israel's supposed to do is they're supposed to approach one of these cities and give it an offer of peace. And what that means is offer it vassalage. All right, you'll become our vassals. And if they surrender and say, thumbs up, let's do it, then they become essentially your mas is the Hebrew word that's used there. And it can be translated tribute. It can be translated corvée labor. But the idea is that when there's a building project that Solomon wants to do, he says, city, give me your people. You're going to come work.
Send your workers, send your funding, and
exactly.
Lovely stuff.
But that's the best case scenario for a city. The worst case is if they put up a fight. And if they do, Israel's supposed to go in and emasculate it, quite literally, right? Kill all the men and the women and children, and their livestock and everything become plunder. Right? So, this sort of rationale, there is no. It's not like there's this, and then there are these other cities that just don't even worry about them. Live and let live. It's like, where's that option? So it's very much that mentality. of we're right, and not only we're right, we are the right.
Yeah.
We're the good, and we're bringing that good quite forcibly.
And to glorify Yahweh's name throughout the world,
Exactly. Yep.
So it got me thinking, because when I was growing up, Jehovah's Witness, and that we were taught about how and the light that Israel was put into was it's this small nation, it's very peaceable, it's getting bullied by all of its neighbours. Is that accurate within history, or is there more a sense of Israel being this conquering, sort of nasty sort of peoples?
It's really neither. So, there are people that specialize in this, right? Archaeologists and biblical scholars that sort of specialize in the ethnogenesis of Israel. So if people are interested, William Deaver is a great person to read on this. Something a little more technical is Avraham Faust. He wrote a 2001 book on the ethnogenesis of Israel. It's an excellent read. I have a book. The book that's coming out has a chapter on archaeology, and I kind of deal with a little bit of this, but I'm pulling from all those sources and sort of distilling the information. But essentially, from the information that we have, it used to be, before biblical archaeology became like a sound discipline, let's say, that the conquest model was the model, right? So Albright, and everybody before him, this model of, well, the Bible shows them coming, from the east across the Jordan and conquering, and so this is where Israel is to come from, and that fell apart pretty quickly once archaeological excavations started taking place inside of Israel. Digging at places like Jericho and Ai and some of these other major cities. It seems like really Hatzor is the only one that sort of fits the model, right?
Right.
And it's not even fitting it in the original way that it was thought. But anyway, so that conquest model sort of went by the wayside, and then it was there's some other theories, like, well, maybe this is a sort of a peasant revolt idea, and that's where this came from. But really, I think what we're looking at, just again, people can read. Mary Ellen Buck has a 2019 publication, a little short thing called "The Canaanites," which is really interesting. William Deaver's 2020 publication is really good on this. But essentially, what I think we're looking at is Israel. The Israelites were Canaanites, right? They're people living in Canaan, and ethnicity is a really interesting topic, and certainly it's not my area of specialization. But looking at how people, if you think about what the biblical text is doing, the Hebrew Bible is doing, is it's setting up parameters to separate themselves from the Canaanites, from the surrounding nations. So this idea of establishing the ethnicity of Israelite ethnicity, starting in the early Iron Age and moving down into Iron II, into the first millennium, you start to see this ethnicity being really substantiated, and I mean, that's what you would expect, I think.
Yeah.
So I think what we probably, I think in the end, we'll probably see that it's a complex thing. You probably do have. There was always a lot of movement, for example, between Canaan and Egypt, right? It's funny when people talk, oh man, the Hyksos, right? Oh man, you got these Asiatics down in Egypt and they're ruling. This must be the Joseph story. No, I mean there's always movement back and forth, always. So anyway, I think the point that I was trying to make is that there probably were some people that came out of Egypt, like a handful of people, that came out of Egypt. Maybe. If you think about what happened, like the first time we see Israel, the first time we know of Israel is in 1207. There's a monument called the Merneptah Stela, and it's an Egyptian. The pharaoh Merneptah says, "I laid waste to Israel," and amongst all these other Canaanite nations or nation states, right? Or people groups. Nation states is too much, but people groups. And what was going on just before that was this period of international diplomacy. So Egypt and Assyria and Babylonia and the Hittites and the Mediterranean, the like Western Anatolia, and there's all this trade and this international diplomacy going on. It's called the Amarna period. And during the Amarna period, we have 350 letters, cuneiform tablets, of exchange between these major powers, and a whole bunch of them between the pharaoh, between Egypt, and his vassals in Canaan. So Canaan is made up at this point of all these little people groups. We know a lot of them, a lot of the little kings of these little cities. And we know their names. We know what their problems were because they wrote about it. We have them. If people want to read them, William Moran in, I think, 1992 published them in English. And I don't think it's that expensive to get it. But you can read the Amarna letters, Amarna. And it's fascinating. I talk about it in the book a little bit. But so the problems that they have, what we don't see is superhuman Nephilim, right? Ruling these huge superpower cities in Canaan. No, they're these little dinky, seemingly powerless cities that are infighting with each other. And they're writing to the pharaoh because, see, Egypt was in control of much of Canaan for most of the Amarna period. It was it was their vassal. Right, so you had garrisons, you had outposts, Egyptian outposts throughout Canaan, and so this idea that there's these superhuman giants that are running all these massively walled cities, not only does that not pan out archaeologically, it just doesn't make any sense from what we have textually.
Yeah, I've always wondered about the Nephilim in the Bible.
I mean, it leads me to another question I kind of had about that, based on what you just said. When did this monotheistic understanding of Jehovah emerge, or was it always understood as the one and only true God, as opposed to maybe the Canaanite version of Jehovah?
So that's obviously a very complicated question. Before I try to answer it, Mark Smith is sort of the go-to guy. He wrote a book called, it's got monotheism in the title. I can't remember the rest of it. But also Ted Lewis published a book recently, 2020 publication, huge. But he talks about Israelite religion. So the question is sort of twofold. What is it that the actual early Israelites were doing? I think we know the answer to that pretty well.
Yeah.
And then what is it that the later biblical writers, what sources are they pulling from? What traditions are they pulling from? And how are they crafting them to their own ends? So to tackle the first question, we know archaeologically, and archaeologically it's pretty clear Israelites were polytheistic society, just like the Canaanites were, right? So the Baals, Yahweh's got a consort, Asherah. And again, this isn't my area of expertise at all, but you have, there's not a lot distinguishing Israelite worship from Canaanite worship early on. And again, you see this in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, what is it that Josiah's wrestling against, right? He's tearing down the Asherah poles, right? So I mean, what the Israelites were doing, I think, is pretty clear. So then the question becomes, when did it sort of switch to like a monolatry, right? The idea that Yahweh is the main God, or the top God. These other gods, these other divine beings exist, but they're not, Yahweh's in control. And I think passages like Psalm 82, Deuteronomy 32 give us insight into that sort of thing. And again, I know I always say this, not my area of expertise, but I think Deuteronomy 32 is arguably this is the passage where it talks about El and Yahweh, and are they two different entities? Yahweh is given Israel as an inheritance, and the rest of the nations are given to these other deities. And this isn't weird from the rest of the perspective of the Hebrew Bible. Like if you go to Daniel 12, you see the I think it's Daniel 12, the Prince of Persia. Yeah, I think it's Daniel 12. I can't believe I can't remember that chapter. But it says I was fighting against the Prince of Persia, and when he goes, the Prince of Greece will come. I mean, these are divine beings that are heads over these nations, right? So, but I think what Deuteronomy 32 is probably doing is trying to shape, while maintaining those traditions, like the remnants of them, maybe trying to say there's one God that we need to be worshiping.
And all the traditions that went around that God kind of evolved too. Like, I think there was a king, we used to read about King Manasseh. And Manasseh was like in the child sacrifice, and he was like the evil one or whatever. And then you've got, tree worship in the temple, male prostitution went on. And all of that kind of just got legalized out of the picture to where it's no longer cool to do anymore. But
yeah. I mean, I think we did a video interview back before I knew, not that I know how to do them now, but back before when I really didn't know how to interview people. We had Dr. Heath Dorel on the channel, and he wrote his dissertation and published it on child sacrifice in ancient Israel. And it's published by Eisenbrauns, 2017. Phenomenal book. I would recommend it to everybody to read. And what he's arguing is that there were three types of child sacrifice in ancient Israel. And there was, child sacrifice for vows, child sacrifice just as giving of the firstborn, child sacrifice in dire circumstances. That one we see like with, Mesha, up on the wall fighting against the Israelites, and he takes his firstborn son and sacrifices him, and the power goes out, if you remember that story, against the Israelites, which makes that a weird story because it worked, right? Like it worked. It's sort of akin to the Israelites couldn't defeat them because they had iron chariots. It's like what now? Exactly. But anyway, but the interesting thing that, one of the interesting things that he points out is that not only was their child sacrifice, we don't have a lot of physical evidence for child sacrifice. What we have comes from Carthage, and it comes from the 7th century BCE and later, like down into the 2nd century. It's not evidence from Canaan proper, and it's not from the 2nd millennium, where the Bible is picturing it. But was there probably child sacrifice? I don't even know that I could comment on it in the 2nd millennium, but certainly I think there was very likely child sacrifice going on in Canaan, but also among the Israelites, right? And it wasn't just that they were doing it to the Baals. They were doing it to Yahweh, right? And he makes the argument, and again, I think it's a very good one, and he's not alone in his conclusions. Otto Eisfeld, I think 100 years ago, started making the argument. But at any rate, this, but again, this is what the biblical text is doing, is it's trying to, Ezekiel's making this argument saying, don't do this. And the fact that he says, God never wanted this, well, as Heath Dorel said, you don't make laws against things that people aren't doing, right? So making the argument that Yahweh never even thought in his mind that
The
he would
sins of
want sacrifice of
our fathers.
firstborn. Well,
Yeah.
why do you think they thought he did?
Yeah,
It's like-
there's so
Yeah.
much scripture in this that they talk about the sins of our forefathers. You know, what were they talking about?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Exodus, was it Exodus 22, I think? Don't quote me on that, but, you know, we're talking about the giving of the firstborn, right? I mean, so like this idea of child sacrifice among the Israelites, it's not in any way abnormal to draw that conclusion from the evidence. So, yeah.
Before I continue, I'd just like to mention Susan in the chat is saying, let me find it, it's back here. Yeah, Dr. Bowen makes real history so interesting. So, you know,
I appreciate that.
You've got some love in the chat there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we were talking, we went off on a bit of a tangent, but as I said, extremely interesting. You know, I've learnt so much there. Covered quite a few things, but getting back to the biblical slavery, you know, so we discussed Exodus, what was it? Exodus 25, wasn't it? Or 21? 21, yeah. Do we want to discuss a little bit about Leviticus 25?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I think that's quite a common. There's quite a few arguments from the atheist camp on that verse in particular. So I'll read that out. So it's Leviticus 25, verse 44 through 46, which says, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly."
Yep. So Leviticus 25 is, I think, understanding sort of the whole context of that chapter makes these verses, I don't know, much clearer in their context. So Leviticus 25 is discussing several things, but it's setting up this year of release. Right? At first, it talks about, just trying to pull from memory how it's set up. The first section talks about every seventh year, you know, till the ground for 6 years and grow your food on it. But in the seventh year, the land is to have its own rest, its own Sabbath for a whole year. And so every 7 years, that seventh year, you don't till, you don't reap, you don't do any of that stuff. You just let it sit there, let the land rest. Interestingly enough, just as a side note, I like mentioning this, Israel was in the land for, you know, the math, you know, the way that the biblical text sort of works it out. They were in the land for 490 years, roughly, right? So if you divide 490 by 7, you get 70. There were 70 one-year Sabbaths that the land was supposed to have its rest. And they, you know, according to the Bible, they never let it rest for that year. They kept working it, which was a sign that they didn't trust God, right? Because God was going to have to supernaturally provide for them, was the idea. They'd let it rest for a year, just like we're not working on the Sabbath. So there were 70 Sabbath years that they didn't let the land lie fallow. So when you see later biblical authors, like in Chronicles or in Jeremiah or in Daniel, they pick up on this and they say God kicked Israel off the land into Babylonian captivity for about 70 years. And it was to give the land rest for all the years that they didn't give it rest. So they interpret this to sort of all tie together in that way. So it's interesting how that works. And if you read through Leviticus 26 talks about how Israel will be kicked off the land if they don't obey the law, and they'll be punished 7 times more for their sins and all this stuff. So anyway, it all sort of ties together that way. Just, I don't know why I brought that up. Sorry.
That's okay. Don't worry about it.
I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
oh, I was just going to say, thinking about Leviticus 25 and the situation in Israel, I can imagine, like, if you're an ancient Israelite and you spend your whole day farming and keeping a small flock, you're providing for your family. And what do you do if you have a bad year and you're unable to feed your family?
Yeah.
And the answer is that you're going to borrow from someone who has enough surplus, right?
Yep.
But under Israelite law, this loan would be interest-free, according to Leviticus 25, right?
Yep.
But you still need to pay back what you borrowed.
Yep.
So now imagine you have another bad year and you need to borrow again. So year after year, your debt is just going to like accumulate over time. Yep. You have no way to pay it back. Yep. So you're effectively stealing if you default on the loan, right? So it seems like the only option is to pay your debt with with your labor. And I think that's what the text or what the laws were trying to do is provide like some kind of solution. And that's the apologists will give you too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this sort of leads to one of the main arguments that I hear now. And that is, well, atheist, suggest an economic system that would replace this debt slavery. Go ahead, suggest one. How is it that God would just shut down that slavery? The economy would just fall apart, right? Mm-hmm. Everything would just fall apart. Well, that seems like a really good argument, right? The problem with it is that the text anticipates it. Mm-hmm. So if you read through Deuteronomy 15 in particular, but certainly in Leviticus 25, particularly when you read into chapter 26, but even in 25, the whole point of these laws, for example, Deuteronomy 15, setting free your debt slave, and then providing him liberally with all this stuff from your vineyard, from your flock, wine press, all that stuff, is that's not an economically sound thing to do. Mm-hmm. But the point was, as you're saying, the point was to try to keep Israel on top above the other nations. I mean, remember this sort of language of you will lend to the other nations, but you will not borrow from them. This is the point. We're trying to keep Israel not only solvent, but like high on the hog, right? Mm-hmm. And so God says, look, give to each other, give to each other, give to each other. And when you do, give, what do they say today? Give sacrificially, right? Isn't that what like Benny Hinn and Kenneth Copeland want you to do? Give sacrificially. Mm-hmm. But that was the idea. Give more than what makes sense, essentially, right? And the reason is when you do, that means you're trusting me to provide for you, and I will. I mean, if you read in Deuteronomy how many times God says, and I will bless, and I will bless, and I will bless. And this is supernaturally, I will bless. Mm-hmm. So the not only is there this supernatural blessing aspect that overrides these economic concerns, but in Leviticus 25, God does away with the institution of slavery for Israel. Right, so the rest of Leviticus 25 is essentially, after it talks about the year of Jubilee, which is every 50th year, all debts are canceled for citizens. It's not for everybody. It's not for foreigners. It's not just I know that people read verse 10 and they say, oh, it says throughout the land, all its inhabitants. That must mean everybody. No, it means Israelites. Anyway, but after it sets up the Jubilee, and everybody's supposed to go free in the 50th year back to their property, back to their land. That's how we know it's Israelites. Then it sets up what happens if your fellow Israelite falls on hard times, and there's stages that he can go through, right? Bruce Wells wrote a fantastic article on this in a 2011 edited volume called the foreigner, the law and the foreigner, or something like that. It's Achenbach, Achenbach is the editor. Anyway, but it's called, the article's called The Quasi-Alien of Leviticus 25. But he's going through Leviticus 25 and he's showing, all right, here's the descent that an Israelite can go down. That didn't make any sense. A descent he can go down, but how he can fall into poverty in stages. So first, he becomes poor, help him, right? As you're talking about these interest-free loans. If he sells land, right, then somebody's supposed to try to buy it back. If he can't, then it goes back to him in the year of Jubilee. If, however, he's sold off all his land, he's borrowed money, he's sold off all his land to pay his debt back, but he's still in trouble and he doesn't have any more land to sell, and he has to sell himself to you as a slave, you're not allowed, starting like down in verse 39, you're not allowed to make him work as a slave. And the rationale behind this is that he's God's slave. He's an Israelite, so he's God's slave. So he can't be somebody else's slave. So the Israelites can no longer make their fellow Israelites serve as slaves. They treat them as hired workers. The Hebrew word is sachir, and it's like a paid person, right?
Right.
And so there's a sort of a twist to that. Wells, in that article, makes the argument that that's actually sort of a couched way of making it actually not so great for the Israelite, but nonetheless, the way that the text is setting it up is it's supposed to be a good thing that's being done for the poor Israelite.
Yeah. The same thing, like with Deuteronomy 15, 12 through 14, I think it was. And basically, if your brother, a Hebrew, man or woman sells themselves to you, they serve you for like 6 years. On the 7th year, you let them go, and you don't let them go empty-handed. You furnish them out of your farm and, wine press, and the Lord God will bless you. And it was kind of like the Israelite slave was not expected to just start over from scratch.
Exactly.
He benefited from his labor, and so he provided him with liberal amounts of, grain, wine, livestock in order to get on his feet and help him out, And
again, the rationale from the text point of view here is that you can't have. Think about what Deuteronomy's doing. It's the last, it's the last statement of Moses, the last hoorah of Moses before he dies, and Joshua takes the Israelites and goes into the land. Well, they're going in. They can't go in and establish superiority in the land as a bunch of poor people. It can't do that. It won't work. You can't have like this, this elite class of really rich people and then all these poor people, because you see what happens in Leviticus 25. What the text anticipates will happen in that circumstance. So if you go to verse 47, it talks about if a resident, like a tenant farmer, a foreigner who's living in the land, who's renting, renting out land from an Israelite and paying the rent and then keeping the surplus. If he does so well that he actually establishes wealth in the land, so much so that he can afford to buy Israelite slaves, then what do you do? Right? So this idea of the Israelites being in a position where they would have to sell themselves to a foreigner, no good, right? This is what Deuteronomy wants, is powerful Israel, superior Israel. And so, as you said, Scott, it's like you don't want this poor person going back out, struggling, being seen to struggle. This is the idea. You want all of them to be these wealthy, robust, able to loan to the foreigners, people. So that idea carries over in Leviticus 25 as well. So then the question arises, like coming to our verses, well, if we can't treat Israelites as slaves anymore, Exodus 21, we could treat them as slaves. Deuteronomy 15, we could treat them as slaves. well, if we can't do it anymore here in Leviticus 25, where do we get our slaves from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's why, if you look at how that, I think the NIV does it this way. Does it say, as for your male and female slaves? Is that how it fronts it?
Yep.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
What it's doing is it's not like crazy abnormal, but it's emphasis word order in the Hebrew. So it's not just saying you may purchase male and female slaves. It's as for your male and female slaves. It's fronting it, emphasizing it. So like, where are you going to get them? As for your male and female slaves, they're to come from the nations around you, from the Goyim, right? And that word generally does carry negative connotations. They're the bad people around. And then you can also get them from what's called the Toshav, the Toshavim. And these are these like tenant farmers. This is a person that's, foreigners can't own land in Israel. They can't, like it's God's land and he's given it to his Israelites. So foreigners can't, in that conventional way, own land. So they can rent it from an Israelite. And that's what these are. These are like tenant farmers.
Yeah. Temporary residents living among you. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so what that means ostensibly here is that, let's say I'm a tenant farmer, I'm a temporary resident, and I'm working my rented part of land here, and I have this bad crop year, or I come in and I'm renting the land and I need to borrow some money so I can get some grain and get some farming implementation or whatever. And I come to you, an Israelite, and I say, hey, I need to take out a loan. You give me the loan. I have my bad crop year. You're allowed to take me as a debt slave, right? And the way that the text sets this up is that there is no 6-year release, right?
Right.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
And there is no stipulation that says if they're coming from the nations around you, like you go and you buy a slave from Edom, for example. There is no set them free in the 6th and the 7th year. There is no release them at the year of Jubilee. This is why the language is very specific. It uses several terms that are very, very important here. The first one is achuzah. And achuzah is that word that's translated property. And the reason that's so significant is that throughout Leviticus 25, it talks about the land that Israelites have as an inheritance. And that land is called achuzah. So if I'm an Israelite, I have this plot of land or these couple of plots of land or whatever, that's my achuzah. That's my landed property. And that stays in my family. That's the whole point. I can't sell it. If I do sell it, Jubilee, it comes right back to me, right? So it stays in my family.
Yeah, you can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and make them slaves for life.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is the only place that achuzah refers to a person.
Human
There's a
beings,
place. There's a place in Ezekiel 44 where God is referred to. He refers to himself as achuzah. It's a different context, sort of. But the point here is that, and I can explain that because I know it came up in the debate. I can explain that if anybody wants me to. But
Of course.
the point here is that just as that piece of land reverts back to you if you sell it, stays with you, gets passed down to your children, it's inherited property, so also is this foreign slave. He is your inherited property. And that's why it then goes on to say, you can pass them on as inheritance to your children after you. They will serve you la'olam in the Hebrew, which is forever, right? There's not this idea of there's a point in time where, all right, he's no longer, they're no longer your slave. So that's what Leviticus 25, 44 to 46 is doing. Is it's setting up that strong contrast.
And as we saw in Exodus earlier on, that also accounts for the children of the slaves as well. They would also be in servitude to the master.
And this, to the moral problem that we were talking about in the opening, like about slavery in general. It's just wrong and it's bad. But then, you kind of get the sense of the slavery apologists where they can actually argue this stuff. Like, you're laying all this stuff out really in a very clear way, Dr. Josh. And so you can now see how they can take these little items and turn them into justifications. But what gets lost is we're talking about a supernatural God who can bless your land if you just do this, that, and the other, where it seems like this entire process would be avoidable if we're talking about a supernatural being God like that.
So in the book that I wrote on this, I didn't go into the New Testament at all. I didn't go into the antebellum South at all. It's just ancient Near East and Old Testament stuff. After I wrote it, I got to thinking, I was sort of playing around with this stuff in my head. The question that I kept asking to myself anyway was, people always start off these discussions with, well, it wasn't like the American South, right? It wasn't like that. So we can write that off. Wasn't like that. And it was interesting to me because the comparisons that were used were all the things that like we see in the movies or we hear about the horror stories that were horrific. Mm-hmm. It was what was practiced on the ground, right? And it got me thinking, I wonder what the laws were in the antebellum South. So in the book that I just wrote, I have a chapter on slavery because I thought I should add one, but I added a section about the New Testament, and then I added a section about the antebellum South. And what's very interesting and kind of scary is that if you read through, there's a book by Thomas Morris, and it's called Slavery Laws in the South or something like that. I need to memorize these book titles, but I never do. But he goes through and, amongst other things, shows what the laws were like in colonial Virginia or in post-revolutionary the different states, Georgia and Virginia and Tennessee, and what it is, how they wrestled with, how the judges wrestled with what to do about slavery. And what the thing that came up over and over and over again, and you can see this in the judges when they're sort of writing out their decisions, their official decisions. They say things like, you can't abuse slaves. That's illegal. You can't murder slaves. If you murder a slave, it's like killing a free white person. That's the punishment that you get. And no good, God-fearing Christian would abuse or murder a slave. And you go, well, God, the laws must have been no slavery, right? Nope. Right? The laws were, well, yeah, because right after that they say, but obviously a slave has no reason to listen to his or her master. So corporal punishment, moderate corporal punishment, is absolutely the right of the master and necessary in order to keep good discipline in the household. And it's like, where have I heard that before? Right?
Definitely.
So then when you go back to Exodus 21, 20 to 21, and it says, if a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod and they die immediately, well, then that's abuse. That's murder. There's punishment. However, if he survives a day or two, there is no punishment because they say that's his slave. We see in Proverbs 29, 19 to 21 that it's expected to beat slaves, which is not in any way surprising since all throughout the Proverbs, you're expected to beat your children. If you love them, you beat them with a wooden rod. In fact, if you don't, you hate them. So the idea that you would beat a slave is in no way far-fetched.
Yeah. Proverbs, isn't it? That mentions that. Proverbs 29. Yeah.
And so So then when you come to a passage like Exodus 21, 20, 21, and you see them beating with a wooden rod and they survive a day or two, the rationale here I think is pretty clear, and most scholars I think would agree with this, is that this is trying to determine intent. It's trying to say, all right, wait a minute, was it murderous? Was he abusing and trying to kill him? Or was this moderate correction, and this day or two created mitigating circumstances, potential mitigating circumstances? Like maybe something else killed him. Maybe part of the beating cut his back, which would have been fine, but then an infection crept in, or not an infection because they wouldn't have thought about it that way, but there was some other mitigating circumstances, and the benefit of the doubt is given to the master, and he's not punished. Right? This is the rationale of that law. So looking at how those compare to the legal rationale in the antebellum South was like,
oh yeah.
And again, I'm
on
not
the ground in the antebellum South, then that's evidence that it probably happened in ancient Israel too, and then that leads to the question of God's wisdom and foresight and all of that kind of stuff.
We see it, like if you read through Jeremiah 34, you can see, whether we want to come down on this as actual historical, this is an actual historical event or not. It's irrelevant to the narrative. Jeremiah 34 talks about how they were supposed to keep the slaves for 6 years and set them free in the seventh, and they decided, probably because there was a siege going on, and it's if you keep your slaves, they can't fight, and you have to feed them. So if you set them free, then they can fight, and you don't have to feed them. So they set all their slaves free, but as soon as they got a chance, they went and took them back. So it says several things, right? They're not obeying the law according to the text, and just because it was technically, like legally voluntary that they became debt slaves, they didn't have the physical option in that story of saying, nah, I don't want to go back and be a slave. No, they took them back. So, I think we have to compare apples to apples. It's either laws in the Hebrew Bible and laws in the antebellum South, or practice and practice. But the legal rationale being so similar in so many ways is what frightens me, because like if we forget the past, we're doomed to repeat it. And when I hear Christian apologists saying things like, well, obviously they had to be able to beat their slaves, it's like, oh God, you don't want to say that. It's a very slippery slope to go down.
Well, you make a really good point about apologists who'll say, well, you can't compare, slavery in the Bible with slavery in the South in America. Those are two different things, and you're just kind of showed that's really a false premise. There's actually a lot in common. The laws were essentially the same in the really important aspects of beating people, abusing people, and killing people. It was still the same.
Yeah, this idea that it was legal to, like, the idea that under the law in the antebellum South, that a slave was a piece of shit, like property, in the sense that like a beat up old couch, and I could just take my slave and beat him to death, and the law said, oakley dokley, that's your property. Like, no, now, did they get away with that? Fuck yeah. I mean, like, there's no question they got away with that. And that's the other thing that's scary, is that the way that the laws were set up, and again, not my field of expertise. I don't want anybody to think that I'm some, scholar of the antebellum South, or, American history or something. I'm not. Go read Thomas Morris. But, it's scary because it created these loopholes unintentionally.
Well, here's a question from the chat. James is tired says the phrase "spare the rod and spoil the child" is not a Christian phrase, and it is not in the Bible. Sparing the rod in that sense means that a parent must guide his or her child and teach them. So I think he's saying it's not a physical rod.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things to take note of, and I would just encourage that person to go back and read through the passages that talk about correction. So correction of fools, for example, the rod is for the back of the fool. Looking at how and read and don't take my word for that. Michael Fox, for example, has a phenomenal two-part commentary. I think it's 2 parts on the Book of Proverbs. But I mean, I think Bruce Waltke's got one. There are lots of different. The Hermeneia series has a commentary on Proverbs. But just go pick up some commentaries, read some articles on it. But one of the things that you'll see, first of all, you can't, in Exodus 21:20, you can't beat someone to death with a metaphorical rod.
True.
Right? You can't do it. I mean, I've tried. I'm just kidding. But you can't do it. And so this is sort of a rationalization to try to say that, Proverbs 29:19 says, servants are not corrected by mere words, right, or by words alone.
True. Very true.
And going on in 21, it says a servant or a slave that's pampered from youth will turn into a son, which essentially means like he's not going to do what he's supposed to do. So, if you read what Michael Fox says about that, for example, it's that I could pull up the quote in my book, but essentially, beating a slave was not only like permitted, it was actively encouraged as in managing a household. So yeah, I would just challenge that person. Certainly don't take my word for that, but go read read what Michael Fox has to say about that, or read what
I think in the debate we were talking about from yesterday between with G-Man and everything, they were talking about, I think the opponent was bringing up one of the scriptures that spoke about how beating your slave was actually not just expected, but it was sort of suggested, because if you don't beat them, they're not going to listen to you. That scripture, that those passages that talk about that. So that couldn't be a metaphorical rod, I would think.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that the rod is used in many, this is where the problem I think lies with people is, words are multivalent, right? Or polyvalent. So you can find the word eved, for example, the word for slave, gets everybody in trouble because, if you take it outside of the Hebrew Bible, the word slave shows up in Semitic, like in Akkadian, or even in Sumerian. And it has, like in that Amarna period that we were talking about, the kings of these cities that were writing to the Pharaoh would say, I write to you, my lord, as your slave, right? Well, wait a minute. He's not a slave. He's not like working in the Pharaoh's home, Well, that's a use that, what is it? I always forget what it's called. Venn diagram, right? Isn't that where you have two circles that kind of overlap?
Yep.
So in the same way, like that word eved, that word slave or wardu in the Akkadian carries this idea. It has certain, what do they call it? Constellation of characteristics, right? And just like the word run, or really any word, right? Megan is my boss, right? I'm using that in a very specific, with a very specific nuance. My wife is my boss. I mean, she is, but I'm using that in a certain way. So
a running nose, a running person.
Exactly. So then when we look at Eved and we say, well, now, wait a minute, a king can be an Eved, Moses can be an Eved, the servant of the Lord is an Eved, wait a minute. That means that everywhere we see it, it must be this sort of, good. It's like a good thing. Moses is the servant of the Lord. That's got to be good. And the problem is that that's not how language works.
Right.
And so what drives the meaning of a word is its context, right? And So you have to look at a context and say, well, in this context, the text says, "Do not treat my people as eveds. Don't treat your brother as eveds." Well, it's not a
That's
good thing there, right? Can't be
Mm.
exactly
good. So if you want an eved, you get them from the nations around you. Well, that's the type of eved that we're talking about. So,
right.
yeah, it's
Man,
contextually driven.
we all make fun of the theists that pull the context card. So it's like, it's so funny. We'll point fingers at each other for that same thing, and then who's really right on that. But
Yeah.
I think, like I always do, I always just go with the consensus of experts in any given topic and let them figure that hermeneutic out.
Yeah.
Because these guys know better than me.
And
I
that's
was gonna say, do we want to? It's coming up to it. Well, it is. It's 1.5 hours we've been on stream now. Do we want to close up the main show here? And if you want to stay on for a little bit, Josh, there's a couple of people who want to join in and ask some questions from the chat.
yeah, sure. I can
Yeah,
probably hang for
yeah.
10, 15 more minutes, or yeah, it's
Yeah,
fine.
so I'll close up the show and we'll have a short intermission. Pop to the toilet. Have some fill up the drinks and that. And then and then I'll just continue this on into an after party and get some more people in on the conversation.
Sounds good.
Um, yeah, so I'll close up the main show. So thank you very much, Dr. Josh. Very, very, very informative conversation. I've absolutely loved it.
Oh, it was
Um,
fun.
And I think the people in the chat have been loving this conversation as well. Been very educational, and you've made it fun
Cool.
as well. So thank you very much
That's
for
good.
that. Where can everyone find you?
Oh yeah, Digital Hammurabi, Hammurabi. We have a website, digitalhammurabi.com, or our YouTube channel. All the links are everywhere. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook now, oddly enough, which is new. It's just under Joshua Bowen, my name. So
Yeah, so definitely everyone, please check out Joshua Bowen. He's absolutely amazing, as you've seen tonight, and he has some great content over on Digital Hammurabi. Very, very informative stuff. If you want to learn Sumerian and read cuneiform tablets, he's got a course for that as well. So,
indeed.
um, I'm going to close up to after party now. So thank you for everyone who's joined in. If you want to wait around for 5 minutes, I'll play some music and have a short intermission, and then we'll get that started. As always, please remember, ignorance is never bliss. Thank you and good night.
But I will only ask one of the questions because there's other people wanted to talk
Right,
to
we're on
him.
air.
It's short. So.
Right. So welcome everyone to the after party for the Joshua Bowen special. We've got Scott Williamson, Dr. Josh. We also have Joshua, James, and I think we've got, is it Junius Norris with us? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So welcome everyone, and if you've got any questions for Dr. Josh, or we just want to continue on with the conversation, just ask away. I'll leave it up to you now.
Alrighty, Dr. Josh, we've met a few times in passing. I think you were leaving a stream and I was joining a stream. My username is James is Tired. But
Okay.
my question for you is, it's Deuteronomy 32 was one you were quoting that you thought confirmed other gods. But when I went to Deuteronomy 32 and I read it, it said, Deuteronomy 32:17 said, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods that they had never known, to new gods that had came up recently, whom the fathers had never dreamed. But when I read the Bible and I go through these, there's always,
Understanding of what I'm saying. So I think the point of Deuteronomy 32 is to say what you're saying. I think the writer of Deuteronomy 32 is trying to take older traditions and, while not drastically doing away with those traditions, pull them together. For example, I think that, and this is not my area of expertise, again, I would encourage you to read Mark Smith on this or Ted Lewis. But I think what the writer is doing there is trying to equate El and Yahweh. There's this debate, right, in that passage about is El a separate deity from Yahweh, and what's the text doing? I think that the writer's trying to put both of them to say this is one and the same, and not, the old El, gray-haired deity, separate from Yahweh, giving Yahweh his inheritance. I think they're trying to equate the two. But it betrays, I think, the older tradition, the way that it has the text set up. I think you can see the older tradition in it, even though it's trying to morph it together. In the same way, I guess, that you can still see in Genesis 1 the Enuma Elish. Like if you read through the Enuma Elish, and it talks about when on high these things hadn't taken place, and then you see sort of this chaos kampf, this the cosmic battle for creation that takes place. You can still see that in Genesis 1, but they're very intentionally, I think, demythologizing that whole, the sea monster is there in the background, demythologized. So Tehom, the deep there, I think is almost certainly Tiamat, the same root that's pulling from the Enuma Elish, but it's doing it very intentionally. In this, I keep saying in the same way because I keep thinking these analogies. I think this is a good one. So just go with me for a second. There is an old Sumerian text called Ninurta and the Anzu bird. And the story is about this bird that steals what's called the Tablet of Destinies from the senior god Enlil. And he flies out into the mountains. And the gods come together and say, who's going to go fight against Anzu bird to take back the Tablet of Destinies? Because the Tablet of Destinies was this tablet that if you had it and you spoke, you could control nature, you could control the world essentially, and speak things, and things would happen. And so all the gods are too scared to go out and fight. Ultimately, Ninurta, the deity that becomes the super king god, he goes out and fights. He loses initially, and through some craftiness, he's able to win. Later on, the story, Enuma Elish, borrows, you can see it borrowing very intentionally certain phrases, certain motifs. It's very clear that it's borrowing, it's revivifying, they say, Ninurta with Marduk. But what some of the differences are, and they're very intentional differences. For example, Tiamat is this senior god, this big god that is creating all these monsters. And one of her cohorts, Kingu, has the Tablet of Destinies. And as Marduk just approaches Kingu for the first time at a distance, even though Kingu has the Tablet of Destinies, he's defeated just by Marduk's presence. Like just by him approaching, he's defeated. And so the point is that they're drawing upon the Ningirsu idea, the Ningirsu motif, the Ningirsu. They understand that people are going to know that Ninurta Ningirsu story, and they're going to hear that Marduk is approaching somebody with the Tablet of Destinies, and they're going to go, "Oh my God, Marduk's going to get his ass handed to him first." But as he approaches, just his presence, the power of his presence, destroys Kingu. It's like people would go, "What the?" And the same thing I think is happening in the biblical text. You know, in passages like Genesis 1, somebody that reads that knows the Enuma Elish story and goes, whoa, like God doesn't even have to fight against Tiamat. He just speaks, and it's done. So it's a very intentional utilization of a genre, but in a polemic sense, in a modifying sense, to say essentially at its core, it's not your God, it's ours. Our God is the great one, if that makes sense.
What correlation have you done to link these two? Because, for example, I have a friend of mine, Chris Hansen. I haven't talked to him in a few years, but he goes hard after mythicists because they look at a lot of stories in the Middle East,
sure,
a lot of history, and they say, okay, this had a dying and rising God, so arguably Christianity had to borrow. Now, when you look at those people, they were separated by time, vast distance, and there's no way they could ever link. So what way did you source this to link and say that the biblical text had to borrow from this?
Sure. So Chris Hansen, I really like him. We're good buddies. And I agree with him on the mythicist position. To sort of put that out, there was a book, The Golden Bough, is a Fraser, I think, that sort of did this, parallelomania is what they call it. And actually, Seth Sanders wrote on this somewhat recently, where he's trying to get at, there's a figure named Enoch, who is part of this Apkallu tradition, if you're familiar with any of that stuff, and Etana, and he wrote this book trying to see how is it, we definitely have connections here, but how did they take place? Where did that connection take place? So it's a good question. It's sort of the $64,000 question, right? So let me back up to answer your question of how we know. The flood story, for example, there's direct correlation, for example, between verbiage that you see in Atrahasis, the Akkadian flood story from the second millennium, and what you see in the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9. And sort of some of the ways that these things go about is there's, if you look at Fraser's kind of going very broadly and going, well, you have a God that dies and then seems to come back. Well, that must be connected. Well, that's okay. I mean, we need to have a little more than that. So like Inanna being hung on a pole for 3 days, like hung on a peg, I'm not really going to make that connection. There has to be something a lot more substantial. So when you look at, for example, the Psalm, and the Psalm is escaping me which one it is, it's later, but where Yahweh is called the rider on the clouds. And I haven't looked at this in probably 6 years, that particular Psalm, but some of the language that's used there, they're hapax legomena in the Hebrew. They're words that don't appear elsewhere in Hebrew, but they're Ugaritic based. And, that's where the rider on the clouds, Baal, the rider on the clouds, comes from. And so these are some of these things are, you sort of weigh, you have some linguistic evidence that says, there's verbiage here that is a little, it's sort of like, it's sort of like looking at plagiarism. Not that they're plagiarizing, but how do you figure that out? Well, are they in the same order? Do they use sort of the same words? the more similarity that you have between those two, the stronger of a case that you can make. You see this sort of thing, and I'll shut up. But you see this sort of thing in Exodus 21. I think David Wright wrote a book recently, 2010 maybe, where he made the comparison between the Code of Hammurabi and Exodus 21, the way that Exodus 21 is laid out. I don't know that I agree with the extent that he goes to say, well, they're actually looking at a tablet that has the Code of Hammurabi and they're ordering Exodus 21 based on that. Maybe, but there's definitely a legal tradition that stands behind that at a minimum. Where you see, for example, something like the goring ox. It's hard to get around something like the goring ox, where you have the laws of Eshnuna, or the laws of Ornamu. I think it's Eshnuna though, but where it's like, man, there's so much similarity even in the verbiage here, the way and the legal rationale behind what happens, to say there's not at least a legal tradition that stands behind this that's affecting both or informing both.
I think
Made
what
any
James
sense.
is getting at,
Thank you for answering my question. I didn't want to take any more because
They were
others.
great
But
questions.
the psalm
Great
you're
questions.
looking for is Psalm 68. If anybody wants to read it.
Perfect. Thank you.
yeah, it's kind of like, I think what James was alluding to was trying to make that connection, because I think with kind of the what the scholars do and the history does is doing something a little different than what the theology does. So the theology is trying to connect things together and build like this internal consistent story narrative, whereas like the scholarly history and the factual simply wants to lay out the facts and kind of just compare notes with different cultures, compare notes with different hermeneutics from different literature, and see how they're connected and see how they may be similar and things of that nature. Whereas the theology is trying to keep it separate and just build within its own structure and framework. And that's what I was thinking about when he asked the question was, wow, this kind of goes back to the old problem with the apologists versus the anti-apologists. Like, we're all kind of arguing from different, or making points from different viewpoints, and it's kind of hard to make that correlation sometimes, depending on where you're coming from.
Yeah. There is a book, Citation and Allusion. It's an edited volume. Zioni Zavit, I think, is the editor. I hope I didn't massacre all of that title, but it's pretty recent, maybe 2017, I think. Anyway, but dealing with this issue, how do we say what's an allusion to something? What's an echo of something is the word that he uses in his introduction to the book. And it's difficult. And there are certain things that the greater linguistic and thematic and contextual and maybe even polemic, consistency that you see between, the borrowed text and the receiver text or something. The more consistency, the more likely you can say, yeah, they're taking this. Like the quintessential example is when the Assyrians came down and conquered Babylonia and took, I think under Sennacherib, took a copy of the Enuma Elish. It took tablets back up to Assyria to the north, and you then see this Assyrian version of the Enuma Elish. And what they did is they kept the story essentially the same, but they pulled out Marduk's name and put Asher's name in it. Mm-hmm. That's a very clear example of when the story's the same. They just put his name in. So I think that would be like on one extreme. That's on one pole. They're clearly, doing it. And then another would be like, on the other end would be like, well, you have chaos comp and you have chaos comp. And so maybe they're, it's like, okay, maybe. But
yeah,
Are they looking at that tablet? Is it just the idea of chaos conf, and they're each producing something?
Well, yeah, it's like with the flood story, for example. We could say, well, yeah, there's the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's the Noah story and the creation story in the Bible, and there's all these different regional flood stories that go on. And from a theological point of view, one could be creative and say, well, there's a common event that happened, and then out of that event, these people all created stories based on that common event. And so maybe a theological argument to that would be, yeah, you're right. There are commonalities between, the gods and the stories and the things of that nature. And it's all because there's a common thing. These gods did exist, or this god did exist, or that's the theological point of view. Then there's a naturalistic explanation like, well, there's a regional flood, and then everyone interpreted it as a supernatural event because it was such a huge event or something like that. And so these different religions incorporated those local stories into their cultures, and that's the natural argument. And so I guess it kind of depends on everyone's presupposition, where they're coming from, And so you're kind of they're all kind of making points from different views or whatever. But yeah. For one, I go with the naturalistic stuff though.
Just to let everyone know, I've managed to get the cam borders and the webcams up on the stream now, so you're all on the screen now for the after party.
The Brady Bunch.
I've probably got like 5 more minutes. I could probably take another question or two, but I gotta get some sleep.
Yeah, that's absolutely sound. Anyone got any questions for Josh? I guess not.
Yeah, actually, I do. I'm sorry, I was eating something, so I didn't want to talk with my mouth open. Full. But I was wondering, when we look at Sumerian, or
your audio's breaking up a bit.
Sumerian look at society, Sumerian culture, a very big people. All right. Am I better? A little bit?
No, you're coming through very broken up. Let me see if it's something on my end.
Okay, hold on. I'll figure this out. All right, somebody needs to... I'll be back.
Well, it was clear there at the end.
Yeah. More to that question, because he's also an archaeologist.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Maybe he'll pop in.
Yeah, it'll probably just be connection issue of some sort.
Our friend Mr. Norris is quiet.
Whoa. Why is it coming through as all echoey? What the hell? I shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, try again, James. Might fix.
I think it could have been me. I may have had the stream. Oh no, it's still echoing.
All right. Am I coming through better now?
Hi, I'm just listening to everybody.
Okay, perfect. So what I was trying to state beforehand was that we kind of see that there's a similarity within the Sumerian culture, and obviously it's very difficult to pinpoint what Sumerian culture is because they were all city-states prior to being amalgamated into imperium from the Assyrians, Babylonians, and so on, or even the Persians afterwards. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be a metamorphosis from the I don't really want to say into this
You're
but there
breaking up.
really does seem to be some kind of transmutation of individuals that.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I? Oh no! Again?
Mhm.
All right. I'm gonna back out again. Try to come back in.
Oh, poor Josh.
I feel bad for him. I've been there many times.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dr. Josh has to get up early tomorrow to work and everything. So
It's
That's
funny.
rough.
It used to be that like I could do these on a Friday night or a Saturday night. It wouldn't be a big deal but I have a 3-year-old now that he's under the impression that 5 o'clock is when he needs to be up and at 'em, and he'll come running in and he'll say, "Dad, it's morning time."
Oh, wow.
And if you say yes, he goes, "Woohoo!" Yeah.
That's hilarious.
And Megan's pregnant with twins that are due in
Mm,
July. So we were gonna have thank you. We were gonna have 5 kids in
3.
our house.
Oh, 5. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
woo.
Welcome back.
It's good to be back. Hopefully, the audio could keep with me.
I think it might be something on my end. No, go ahead.
Actually, I'm going to move. What? Okay. When we when we look at Sumerian society as a whole, after when they were before that they became imperium, or before the imperium came upon them, there does seem to be a lot of borrowing within that society of different stories. In a sense, there seems to be interconnecting stories from different city states that slowly but surely over time amalgamated into, let's just say, the theocracy, or maybe the polytheist theocracy that came about afterwards, where it sort of seemed more fundamental rather than fragmented story. Remember, in Saturday, I was going to actually ask him a question as well, based on his idea that stating that, well, because there were such vast peoples or peoples that lived in such a vast area, how would you think about these areas gaining a sense for their belief or mythos? But I think that is a huge possibility, because there was a lot of borrowing, and definitely within the Middle East, there does, let alone, I know, in this valley, in
You're cutting out, man.
China and everything like that. But where we're focusing on the Middle East, it seemed that generally it is unreasonable to see these far vast regions distributing these ideas to each other.
All right, so I think I caught
these concepts, these symbols.
Yeah, I think I caught most of it. And I think that's, if I understood you, like, is it unreasonable, even though it's a wide geographical area, even over chronologically rather disparate periods, that we still see continuity between them. Is that sort of roughly okay? Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. So a couple of things that we see that come to mind anyway for me. During the Amarna period, Marion Feldman wrote a book on what's called the Ugaritic Koine. And basically, Ugarit, is this sort of trade center. At least it's on the Phoenician coast. It's part of Canaan, and they developed a great deal of wealth. But one of the things that you see in their material culture is you have, she argues, and I think pretty convincingly, that you have like Egyptian motifs, you have Assyrian motifs, you have stuff from I think Western Turkey, but they're bringing it all together into this, what she calls this koine for the period. And I think the point is that the Amarna period in and of itself shows that there's international continuity throughout. And one of the things that happens, given that cuneiform is being used throughout these regions, we know that, for example, the corpus that I worked on, Sumerian literary and liturgical texts, we see those down into like the Seleucid period in Mesopotamia. Like they're still being used actively in ritual. Like there's a ritual from Seleucid period Uruk where they recover a kettle drum with an ox hide, and there's a ritual that has these laments that were being the same laments that were being cited, 1800 years earlier or whatever, and being used in a very similar way. So the point, I think, is that this idea that, we obviously have to be incredibly careful, as James was pointing out, about this parallelomania, where we're seeing connections everywhere, right? We're seeing patterns everywhere. And then trying to, what I think the big danger in something like that is then importing their meaning into your context or into that other context. That's one of the big problems. What you have to be able to do, I think, in a region like this is not only say, are they, for a lack of a better term, borrowing from or alluding to that source that we're thinking about, but what are they doing with it? And if you can answer the question reasonably, what are they doing with it? I think that then allows you to further determine, were they actually thinking about that source material? And the thing is, this is the last thing I say about it, you have scribal education that is, I think people underestimate what scribal education does during the period that we're talking about in the ancient Near East. The way that scribes learn to write, be it in Akkadian or Aramaic or whatever, the copying out these stories, right, or copying out these texts, these exercises, and that sort of thing, allows the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, to be found, or the Code of Hammurabi to be found in all these disparate places, excerpts of it. And so, yeah, I think we need to make sure that we're careful, as James is saying, to not just go randomly connect everything and then try to import all that information. But we do want to be sensitive to it and say, if we can make that connection, how strong of a connection, and then what is this receiver text doing with it?
Mm-hmm.
If any of that made any sense. I don't know.
No, it did. That's exactly right.
Well, guys, thank you so much. And I don't know if Katie's gone, but thank you so much for having me on.
I'm still there.
That's
okay,
fantastic.
Great. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. Excellent questions. They really were. And I hope I did some of them justice. But
yeah. And once
I'm
again,
go get
Thank
some.
you
very much.
And he already asked the question I was going to ask.
Well, you guys have an excellent night, and I hope to see you again soon.
Good night.
Have a good one, Dr. Josh.
Yeah, he's such a cool guy, man.
So, oh my God, what is happening? Yeah, this isn't working out for me. Okay.
Yep.
More questions, but my area of expertise is not in the same area as his, so I tried to bring other conversation material that I'm not necessarily familiarized, like with theocracy and or theology, I should say, and everything like that.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Dr. Josh has had to go. He's got early morning tomorrow, so I'm going to close down the after party, and then next week I will do the after party through StreamYard. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you very much. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you very much for letting me on. If you can hear me, thank you very much for letting me on. I appreciate it.